Hello everyone, today we talk about Marius' sixth consulship and of Apuleius Saturninus. So, we are in the late Republic, the end of 2nd century BC, after Gracchian times. We are also in the troubled times of the Cimbrian Wars and at the end of the Numidic War specifically, and therefore also in a moment in which Rome is fundamentally putting at its own place several neighbors, whether they were actually not much next door. Actually, Numidia was a far away land. Especially the Romans didn't give a damn about Numidia itself, but Rome had somewhat to respond. The situation had created there. The Cimbrian, the Teutanes, had migrated from the Jutland and ravaged Central Europe, Southern Europe, and now also were about to be exterminated. And Rome is still in a phase that basically will continue, especially from the Numidic War onwards. The main deal with the 2nd century BC had been the Spanish campaigns, right? And this endless series of campaigns in the Iberian Peninsula that had accelerated the process of political and social disruption, especially this can be observed from the military, and that had also brought to the Gracchian reforms because of the crisis of recruitment, etc. And from now on, a further process of actually scene wars will actually start occurring, right? And this will be especially evident from the beginning of the 1st century BC. But here we are in a time where essentially Marius is still basically maintaining a sort of order, right? Marius is rising as one of these warlords fundamentally. With the Marian reform, he had brought to the end fundamentally of the central system of recruitment, so that basically everybody could be simply levied by the so-called warlord that start appearing during the privatization of Roman policy, and Marius, as we'll see, doesn't actually want to subvert the republican system as such, right? He just wants to excel right in it and to dominate it, and this phase is definitely the moment of the peak of Marius. He will cover the consulship 7 times, as you know, and his success is due largely to the Cimbrian invasions, and therefore he was seen as basically the only hope of Rome in this situation. Naturally, the thing is more complicated. Around Marius there is also kind of a mythology having been developed. The same goes for the same reforms and how this actually unfolded. But let's say that here he is the leading figure, and he is keeping this balance, as we will see now, even in moments of great escalation of violence in Rome itself, right? And this is really the moment in which everything is about to crumble, right? Very, very gradually. Still at this time, but definitely this Marius' sixth consulship was wild for what happened in it, and because of the measures that were to be taken. And with Saturninus we observe, and Glaucia, we observe these new figures that we actually don't know in this specific case very much. We don't know what their policy really was about, because most of the sources that talk about them actually portray them in a negative light. But it's evident that there were these scrupulousness figures that were trying to emerge demagogically within a system that now didn't make ideologically much sense anymore. I mean, these people were even were seen as still kind of embracing the Gracchian legacy in a populistic, demagogic sense fundamentally, and yet basically doing it just from their own aggrandizement, and also killing political figures that stood in the way, that were also theoretically from that side, but more than them evidently in that specific context. So it's an interesting phase to observe. So basically in 106 BC, the consul Quintus Servilius Caepio had made approve a judiciary law that cancelled the one of Gaius Gracchus, and that basically took away to the knights, to the equites, the monopoly of the courts de repetundis. The courts de repetundis are very important. They were basically tribunals, right, instituted starting from the 2nd century BC to judge various specific crimes. In fact, the repetundi, the inuria, the maiestas, right? So, and the repetundis was instituted first, right, among these, and it was specifically called to judge those crimes of concussion, right, of the magistrates of senatorial rank, or even of simple citizens, the publicani, for example, that were basically these subcontractors of tribunes that were created for the provinces governed by Rome, right? And the collegium that constituted such tribunals was originally composed by senators, right? But the composition varied over time, right? These tribunals were usually presided by a praetor, right, or by a quaesitor, right? And they decided by majority. The most famous trial will be the one, that saw Cicero, right, during his in Verrem, right, when the praetor of Sicily between 73, 71 BC, abused heavily of his role. But the important here in this specific moment in Roman politics is that the composition of the tribunal had been assigned to the equestrian order by Gaius Gracchus in 123 BC. The tribunal, the repetundis, had been established in 149, right, with the Lex Calpurnia. And eventually, as we have seen now, in 106 BC, it was given back to temporarily to the senators. So the sources, though, are not very clear, because the moderns actually discuss whether Caepio restituted the tribunals to the senators by excluding completely the equites, right, the knights, or if he, actually realized a sort of compromise by creating mixed courts of the two orders, right? So not necessarily Caepio was doing a pro optimatus policy in this regard. There might have been actually other factors going on, including the same composition of the equites, but that could be part of here. But it's and this doubt arises also given that Caepio managed to promulgate this law in a moment in which the equestrian order was actually very active in defending the prerogative bestowed by Gaius Gracchus back in the day. And given that the Jugurthine War in Numidia was at the acme of its success, right, the war was being won by Marius and his officers with the political support in Rome of the equites that since the time of the Gracchi had basically protested against some, actual strategical management of certain wars, and the same Numidian war command was taken from Metellus by Marius, backed by the protests of the equites in this regard. So this was a moment in which the equestrian class was faring fairly well, right? So whatever this happened for, maybe it was not such a radical change. But, however, Caepio's success was due also in part to the support of the great orator Lucius Licinius Crassus, right, who was later taken by Cicero as his own oratory model. And this reform of Caepio actually was short-lived, right? In 101, plebiscite of the tribune Gaius Servilius Glaucia gave back the quaestio de repetundis to the equites, right? Consider in this sense, I forgot to mention that the equites trusted Marius also a lot because he came from the equestrian order, so he, also was importantly. Marius was a homo novus, as you know. He was very far from being a poor person. His family was very very affluent. He was very close to the Roman nobility, but his emergence was a big deal because it was somewhat a different figure from the one that had occurred. It was difficult to break through the Roman nobility in a way, and as you know, Marius had managed to ride the wave of the Cimbrian invasions, right? He had distinguished himself actually since the times of Scipio Aemilianus at the siege of Numancia in Spain, right? So he really rose through the ranks of, the equites were, we don't have to distinguish much the goals of the senators from the one of the equites as such, right? They basically had a common goal, simply the equites were poorer, so they were involved at different levels of society. But naturally, the senatorial policy could vary much, right? There is this bit of this cliche that the equestrians were more entrepreneurial because they came more from the middle classes than the senators. Well, at this time, the modes of enriching were fairly similar, actually, and the thing is complicated. We'll talk about it in another video. But even here, this tribune, Glaucia, appears, right? And Glaucia, therefore, backing the Marians and the equites, right? And Glaucia was closely tied to these other figures of Lucius Apuleius Saturninus, right? That had been tribune of the plebs in 103 BC, and he had approved large assignations of lands in the province of Africa for the veterans of the Jugurthine War, right? This was a great deal. He had also the Marian reform, the soldiers not fighting like, a privilege / duty, like bringing his own equipment, going to war, that had, been an ideal since centuries. At this time, the Roman soldiers received a salary since the siege of Veii, right? So, as we were saying before, what Marius did wasn't much of an actual military reform as such, right? It changed. It was a fiscal and political reform in many ways, and that had, of course, important, massive influence on the military affairs. But once again, it's not because it actually introduced novelties in what the reality of the Roman military practically was. He maybe reintroduced, he uniformed, he standardized, but the thing there is very accessory, right? The most important thing here is the political fact, right? The troops were hired to serve now these warlords that would repay them with the lands of the conquests, right? And that would form, in this sense, a loyal part of a loyal community, right, of Roman citizens to this man specifically. So not to the republic as such, but to the individual man. Another big deal, an enormous deal, actually, was related to the Italics, right, to the non-Roman citizens, or at least also to those Roman citizens of lower degrees, let's say. But the concept here is that a war was to reward those who had fought in it, and there was all this political fight within Roman politics, from the most conservative class that said, okay, we don't want a new part of Roman citizens to get land somewhere else to acquire this other wealth, as especially in relation to the allegiance to this politicians, right, especially this rampant homo novus that Marius was, right, we want to keep our land, still all in our hands and not expanding it in this donations to the veterans, right, that could expand, that could represent competitors, right, compared to the senatorial latifundum. This was an enormous deal. Enormous. This is all the history of the Gracchian reforms and of the social war, and especially during the late Roman Republic, the effect of these changes was very great. So there was always someone who was trying to avoid the concessions of lands to the veterans. Glaucia had and Saturninus had made it, right. The two men in appearance were therefore acting in the political orbit of Gaius Marius, right. Glaucia, for example, sustained the same interests of the equestrian order, over which, as we have seen, Marius' fortunes were founded, while Saturninus cared mostly about the fact that the promises made by the general to his soldiers were maintained. So Marius had himself elected again as consul for the year 100 BC. Right now, especially having eliminated the danger of the Cimbria and the Teutones, there was the problem of the illegality of the continuation of consulship in this way, in a row, right, that was not justified anymore. But Marius, of course, wanted to remain in power, right, and especially in order to ensure that his own veteran, right, the ones especially of the Germanic war, would be compensated with the assignation of new land, just like the ones of the Jugurthine war that, as we've seen, had already been compensated. In 100 BC, therefore, consuls were Marius for the 6th time, and his loyal friend Lucius Valerius Flaccus. Glaucia was praetor, while Saturninus, that had been elected without some difficulty, and especially after having one of his opposers killed, right, was instead tribune of the plebs for the 2nd time. Here, it's important to stress that Roman policy is crumbling, as we've seen, as even violence in the city was flaring, right? At this point, the whole, republican system of offices, of magistracies, of authority, etc., was really tearing itself apart, right? Violence in Rome was kind of normal. And there were all these kind of tricks and sophistries to, allow, some figure to be appointed or not, etc. Or the silliest tricks, like, getting earlier in the morning to be voted in forum, and then, making it happen in this way. Because of these formalities that allowed effectively the ether to happen, and not the rest of the competitors sometimes not having the military strength to oppose themselves by usually storming the assemblies and killing people, as it often happened in this regard, right? Theoretically, Rome had to be this land of Italy in general to be disarmed, right? Armies couldn't be stationed in the city or nearby, but there was weaponry there. Of course, it was a Roman police, but more in general at this point, there was the arming of the mobs by this political figures, Marius included, as we will see now, that could make it, right? Even the same senators could be armed at some point, as will happen later with the end of the same Saturninus and Glaucia. So for some time, this group of Marius, Flaccus, Glaucia, and Saturninus remained compact, right? They presented a new agrarian law that contemplated the distribution of lands and the foundation of colonies in Transalpine Gaul. in favor of not only of the Roman veterans, but also of the Latin and Italic ones, right? It was a big deal because you know that in 10 years it would be here essentially the social war, because still the Roman citizens optimo iure maintained higher privileges of the Socii, right, the allies, that had a varied, they were tied to Rome through various foedera, right, and they varied essentially in the base of the relation with Rome. And some were the aequa, the iniqua, etc. The Latins were generally more privileged because they were the ones that had stuck with Rome since more in the beginning. They were kind of relatively less militarized. They had more economic privileges. The Italics were instead the butchering meat that served in the Roman armies, and had basically they were prevalent, right? There were more Italics than Romans in the Roman army by a consistent margin. This had been the case since the 3rd century, even before. The ratio, the Roman army always had much less citizens throughout all its history than allies in its army, numerically speaking. And this law was a great deal, because now Marius himself was coming from a community of this, that progressively all these various communities in Italy were getting Roman citizenship in some way, right? But large areas were still not, and therefore they didn't benefit of lands assignations and things like this. So there was a huge problem, that is the one you can still find in Caesar, in Claudius, in Nero, and etc. That is, this conservative aristocracy that doesn't want the extension of Roman citizenship and all the privileges coming with it, the inclusion of foreign senators, what were considered foreign senators, even the Italics here were considered foreigners still, and therefore to essentially to share the cake of the empire with someone else, while kind of most progressive, let's call them in this way, and also enlightened minds realize perfectly that if Rome hadn't done this, they would have thrown the Republic engulfed in a war, as would happen with a social war, in fact, simply because you couldn't keep all these people. Italy was massively populated. These people were, as we've seen, the bulk of the Roman army, right? So they also had a substantial force. The social war, it's literally the same type of legionnaire. We know that already by the time of Second Punic War there was no visible difference between a Roman and an Italic legionnaire in this regard. So they were the same Roman army fighting against itself, and it was a hell of a bloody war. So the idea that if Rome had not extended its citizenship and integrated these other peoples, would have not expanded as effectively was going on at this point, right? Rome at this point hasn't, after the campaigns in Greece and in with this endless campaigns in Spain, and there was the annexation, of course, of Corinth, of Carthage, of the occupation, definitely certain areas of Asia Minor. But if you look at Rome itself, it's just basically controlling this most advanced Mediterranean area, right? The coastal areas, right? It hadn't occupied much of a land. It was still a very, minimalistic and kind of conservative view of the power of Roman expansion, right? This had brought the same crisis of recruitment in a certain way. It passed all through the granting of the citizenship to the others, to the allies, and the reason of this had been, in fact, the senatorial class, not right, the senatorial order, not being willing to extend this, privileges, these rights too much, and it had been so since the beginning, right? Just think about the Romans still in the Second Punic War, not think about Quinctus Fabius Maximus and its party. If it hadn't been for Scipio, the idea was we have to remain within Italy, right? It's bad to go out of Italy. we should remain just like this. There would be no empire for that regard. So that's also why the Scipiones, for example, were seen as these great Hellenizers, this great, aliens, culturally speaking, to the Roman nobility, because instead they had realized the enormous advantages that would come from this considered expansion towards the Mediterranean. Think about Scipio Africanus, not even wanted to crush, actually, Hannibal himself after he had defeated, while this conservative bulk of senators, we still wanted even some ferocious measures, including, for example, the assassination of Hannibal himself, and even the sack of Corinth and the destruction of Carthage. And the first one was actually much more important than at the time than the second, right? Because we're essentially the product of this conservative policy, because they just, since Rome had basically lost some ground, had to remain on the defensive, at least on towards certain foes, etc. They decided that to remind everybody what could happen if you oppose Rome. Hence, they sacked Corinth. Right? It was, in comparison, the Third Punic War, the destruction of Carthage was, a very few thing, because Corinth was one of the great capitals of Hellenism, and the Romans had always showed a great, up to that point, a great, formal reverence towards the Hellenistic world on the wake of Alexander, that had theoretically not even to fight to have this civilized peoples bowing to him. Now Rome destroys Corinth, right? And this is it's probably the most radically traumatic event of the whole 2nd century BC, right? The destruction of Carthage, that in the Western world we have somewhat paradigmized it because Rome Carthage, right? But the Third Punic War was a joke, right? It was not even a big deal. But just for making you understand here a bit the context. This assignation of land to the Allies now was really a problem, because the proposal, especially since it appeared very favorable to the Allies, in fact, was bitterly opposed by a part of the Senate, and also by the urban plebs. Right, there was a centrality and important ties that also existed between the city as such, and also the rest of the republic and of the empire proper, meaning the provinces in this regard, because considered that giving lands to veterans outside of Italy, like in this case, like it had happened for Africa and for Transalpine Gaul, was also, as we've seen, extending this, basically replicating another chunk, let's say, of Romanity somewhere else that could take gradually away the importance from the center. So that's how the thing was seen. And now this proposal wanted even to give it to the Italics that weren't even full Roman citizens, right? So what the hell? That was the view, but definitely the growth of the empire proper as such did pass through these ideas, and that's why we mentioned before Caesar, or you can't understand what happened in Gaul, right? If you think it was just greed, or there was an enormous political philosophy behind that. It was all the struggle between the realization of how the integration of these other peoples had to occur for the sake of the same expansion of the Roman Empire. Maybe Caesarianism was not the best answer, but it was a deep reason behind that, aside from, of course, the most prevalent games of power and politics that Caesar was playing. Consider in this sense that Caesar naturally was ideally in the wake of the Marians, right, of the Populares, that were the same guys here were doing this, making these laws, even though the term here is not, aside from the fact that, the difference between optimatus and populares wasn't really a big deal, right? They essentially wanted to obtain the same thing. There was the power in Rome, just doing it through different ways. But it's not that the populares was, less snobbish than the optimatus in certain regard. This is also another deal. but just for saying that there were not two rigidly split parties, there were just two tendencies, right, that blurred themselves very, very often. So because of these protests, basically the tribune Saturninus added a clause according to which, with all the senators, and not only the magistrates in office, like it was in use at the time, had to swear not to oppose the enactment of the law, right? And those who would have refused to swear the oath, they would have been expelled from the Senate. This could be enforced with a plebiscite, right? Plebiscitum that was passed, in fact, after a violent clash between the two sides, right? And in here, the Marian veterans were deployed. They had the upper hand. With here, you realize here what that's the whole deal of the so-called warlords of the late Republic, right? These could simply deploy their veterans, right? Professional killers, right? In their city against the enemies, right? That's what the veterans are designed perfectly to do. And in this case, they were also motivated because that would have brought them the land they had been fighting for, right, and risking their life and dying for. So all the senators therefore swore, so they were obliged, and this is the blackmail of force, as we've seen, except for Metellus Numidicus. Right, that was this figure was substantially opposed to, not much to these views in general, because the policy of the Metelli would be actually favorable to the allies, right? But this was this anti-Marianism, right? And this aversion that existed especially between Metellus and Saturninus proper. Individually. Saturninus was doing all this to kick Metellus out, and in fact, he managed that, right? Because Metellus basically didn't swear, as the plebiscitum asked. He didn't want to bow to his rival, despite maybe the content of this reform was not an enormous deal. But he was deprived of the senatorial dignity, and he went into voluntary exile in Rhodes, right? Consider the Romans, Roman aristocracy at this point was normally going to Greece every once in a while just for getting educated, and as a regular basis. So the Roman aristocracy knew pretty well the Hellenistic world, but it stayed out of Rome, and this was important. They could simply control less in the local affairs. The consuls at this point, Marius and Flaccus, pronounced also against Metellus the interdictio aqua et igni, right? That basically was equivalent to a prohibition to come in the fatherland with the threat of being killed, right? Otherwise, and at this point, however, the Marian coalition begins to dissolve. Because Glaucia, against the law that contemplated an interval of 3 years between the curule offices, presented the candidacy to the consulship while still being praetor, right? So at the next turn, he was running for consul, while that would have required mandatorily 3 years. So even the same other Marians began to freak out. What is this guy doing? And there were very serious disorders breaking out in the city. And among the other things, in order to facilitate the election of Glaucia, Saturninus had another candidate assassinated, Gaius Memmius, that was especially dear to the people and to the knights for the activity that he had carried out during his own tribunate of 111 BC, right? So at this point, you already realize that Glaucia and Saturninus are going astray from the theoretical Gracchian legacy, right? They kill someone who was for the people and the equitas, right? So Marius himself realized that his own occasional allies of this hour had used him essentially to achieve this position of power. And Marius himself, as has been seen before, aspired fundamentally just to excel within the state for authority and cumulation of honors, but not to overturn the republican institutions as such, right? The institutions were dying already by themselves, but still the fiction here was maintained fairly well. So this new behavior was from Glaucius and Saturninus was definitely a surprise and a danger as well. Consider, if there are violences in the city, it's an enormous deal. Here, Rome is really the heart of everything, and the city in itself must be controlled. It must be an order, and Rome is the sacred center of all all the councils of the Senate, right? It must be pacified, right? Aside from the sheer economical cost, etc., of these fights. So at this point, the Senate ordered to the consuls the so-called senatus consultum ultimum, which was basically a last resort, an extrema ratio of emergency that was typical of the last phase of the Republic, right? It was a deliberation of the Senate with which, since the time of the Gracchi, the aristocratic faction had basically emendated the Roman constitution, right? And introducing this clause of state of emergency, right? Videant consules nequid res publica detrimenti capiat. So this was really to save the otherwise unsavable, right? Without such means, which practically translated in itself in re-establishing the order, of course. So Marius, however, still attempted mediation between the two sides, right? Marius didn't actually want to wipe out completely Glaucia and Saturninus. That could still be of some help, right? And this, however, was in front of the Senate considered as an act of of duplicity, fundamental doubleness, and therefore he didn't manage to achieve the agreement. Therefore, together with Valerius Flaccus, he armed the senators, the knights, and the urban plebs, and he assumed command of it. Right, so this is a case in which actually all the factions were armed. So Saturninus and Glaucia, with his most resolute followers, entrenched themselves on the Capitol Hill, right? But quite soon they were obliged to surrender, right? They were overwhelmed, and albeit Marius intended to expose them to regular trial, right? And he basically, even during this fight, eventually captured them and sheltered them. The plebs took over, right? They took refuge, Glaucia and Saturninus took refuge in the Curia Hostilia, and here they were basically stoned to death by the people that had uncovered the roof and started targeting them. So this episode, as many of the late Republic that eventually would especially escalate in the following years, definitely leaves us with certain question marks, right? Because, which aims the two men were pursuing is difficult to tell. Also, because as we were saying in the beginning, the news, the information about him come almost exclusively from hostile sources. And undoubtedly, Saturninus and Glaucia presented at least themselves as continuators of the Gracchi, right? but the facts that we know about them, starting from the assassination of Gaius Memmius, as we have seen, do not confirm such claim. Right? The assignation of the lands to the veterans weren't new in the history of the Republic. Right? There were somewhat sectorial decisions, right, that were very different from the reform through which Tiberius Gracchus had intended to resolve in an organic way the crisis of an entire social class, right? The assignation of lands in Transalpine Gaul here and in Africa were designed essentially to satisfy Marius' veterans specifically, right? So the Gracchi had wanted to resolve the crisis of recruitment to allow basically all the Roman citizens that at this time were impoverishing themselves dramatically, couldn't participate to the army in the traditional way at their own expenses, still in the idea that an equilibrium between all the various classes could be maintained, right? With Marius, this thing gets surpassed because basically they decide, okay, who cares about these people? Let them impoverish themselves and the senators spread, but at least let us, rampant generals and politicians, of course, to recruit as many as we want without caring about their property. And these were all volunteers by this time, basically, because like it hadn't been possible before to at least go fight a war somewhere and getting our fortune built and then eventually mingling in the highest levels of Roman politics on the base of this power. So it's definitely a different direction. This has nothing to do with saving the Roman middle classes that were lost by this time anyway, and it was really just backing Marius, right? Yeah, it's still in a theoretically kind of more equal view of Roman society compared to the one of the senators on average had. Yeah, but still, kind of an elite aristocratic way, right? Elitistic way at least. And so the name of the Gracchi had made a great impression in Rome at this point, right? The greatness had been recognized, definitely. They had not been forgotten. So the people naturally cared about this, and but as we've seen, there were also other factors, such as the problem of the italics, right? We know, for example, there was a lex frumentaria, right? Grain wheat law, right? There was, as you know, it was a legislative provision that regulated the distribution of wheat at, eased prices or even freely for the population of Rome. Well, at this point, Saturninus in 103 BC or in 100 BC, we don't know precisely, had tried to imitate Gaius Gracchus, right, by essentially bringing, and this law had not been passed, right, but he had proposed a political price of grain from 6.3 asses per modium, like the same Gaius Gracchus had established back in the day, to 5/6 of ass. And this is an enormous difference, right? Gracchus had lowered it in a kind of consistent, reasonable, kind of balanced way. This was just basically almost giving grain for free, and such a difference between the two prices makes Saturninus' proposal appear just like purely demagogical, right? And it didn't pass anyway. But that is intention. Like, it's a radical, if you want, demagogic, populistic view, right? Let's give grain for free, vote for me, right? That's the idea. And Cicero confrontates Glaucia with Hyperbolus of Athens in Brutus 224, which suggests implicitly, by comparison with the figure from the Hellenic world, that Saturninus had wanted to establish in Rome a radical democracy of Hellenic type. But it goes without saying that the structure of Roman society was such to, may render this plan completely unattainable, right? Completely different worlds. But there is also this, idea in the air, after all, that of course you can win the masses through this policy, right? The great clash between the optimates and the populares eventually will be played in part also through this demagogic propaganda that will hide, however, the real, let's say, we can't say just hide, but also naturally bring to their side the substantial forces of the Roman world that at this point didn't count maybe much, as we've seen in the army as such, but especially in the control of the city. Like the Roman mob was an extremely important element, because as we've seen before, it wasn't unstoppable. I mean, it was very difficult in the ancient world to control an entire city, right? And especially if the fiction was that the city was disarmed, which is not really the case in here, but at least technically there was someone who at least distributed weapons who could make this policy work. And from there, conditioning all the political ether, because as we've seen, all Roman politics revolved around the sacred ideas, that revolved around in turn around the Senate, the various councils, and all the procedures that were, the ones that Rome had now by religious order as such. So the deal was enormous, and therefore the Roman mob here was also flattered, right, with these ideas of what to get, what benefits they could have had by supporting a certain figure. But at the same time, the late Republic, as we will see, in fact, the same control of the Senate on the city will be lost without the warlords, right? In 52 BC, it's over, basically, and that's where you literally must have an army that ensures that the city is controllable from the outside. Not that, of course, the March on Rome wouldn't happen, right? It would happen, of course, during the civil wars between Marius and Sulla, but I mean, the idea that the Senate at some point can't do anything more, right? And here it's starting to happen in practice. It's starting to have to take shape, this habitual recurring to violence as such, to enforce the political mechanism, and that was, by the way, spoiled by, as we've seen, by this dynamics, occupation of the public spaces, and the intimidation, political assassination, and so on. But anyhow, I would stop it here. It was just a reflection really on these two figures that, of course, we can't know excessively more about. This was a kind of a synthesis, but more or less this is the profile we can trace about them. And we will keep naturally talking about Roman Republican history. For now, we stop it here, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.